Hi, Lindenwood class. We are here to read Echo Mountain. We're going to pick up with chapter 65. Chapter 65. I took Quiet to Samuel. Will you give him back to Maisie? Okay. He looked Quiet over carefully. Did the hag do something to him? Yes, she turned him into a goat, can't you tell? He made a face. Allie. I looked around. Where's Esther? My mother said, she went with Larkin part way back up mountain. She sounded sorry about it. He was upset. She thought he might want the company. I tried not to care, which wasn't too difficult since I had other things to care about. But it wasn't easy regardless. When I turned to go back to my father, my mother gave me a worried look. Are you all right, Ellie? I'm fine, I said, the flame in my chest roaring. I went into the bedroom and shut the door gently. I went to Kate. When I put out my arm, she took it without question and let me help her around the bed to lie down next to my father so I could check her leg. She didn't say a word when I pulled off her leggings and carefully unwrapped the bandages. The wound was still as swollen and angry as it had been, despite the honey, maybe even worse than before. I think we should send Mr. Peterson for the doctor now, I said, wrapping the wound again, so he'll get here in time if the honey doesn't work. We both knew what I meant by in time. And if the honey works, and he comes here for no good reason, he'll want to be paid either way. I thought about what I had to give in trade. I looked at my mother's mandolin. No, Kate said, not that. Not for me. And I remembered another of the 100 questions I had not yet asked her. Larkin said he used to help his father make mandolins. Doesn't he want to be a luthier too? At which Kate closed her eyes. I asked him that very thing, but all he said was, maybe someday. I thought of what else we could use to pay the doctor. Have you no wedding ring? Gone, she said. In trade, long since. I thought about the years since Larkin's father had died, the crash that had made those years even harder. The doctor won't know that we have no way to pay him, I said, until he's already here. And if you fool him like that, he'll never come back here again. She reached out to scratch Captain between the ears. Cry wolf, and you won't have him next time. Then we'll do what we can without him, but right now, no wait and see this time. I remembered the other things she'd tried. Can I pour in some hot vinegar? She considered that. I don't know what it will be like to pour it into an open wound, and we don't want to melt the honey away. Then I'll keep the cut mostly closed for now to hold the honey in, and I'll build a dam around the cut and fill it with vinegar so it seeps in slowly and doesn't spill away. She watched me without saying a word. I thought about the possibilities. There was a candle next to the bed, but I'd been burned by candle wax before, and I was not eager to give Kate a new hurt trying to heal an old one. So I closed my eyes and listened to myself for a while, letting my mind tick through the possibilities until I came to one. One I liked, for more reasons than one. All of them good. I found my mother in the kitchen, tucking balsam chips into pouches. I need an old pot you might never be able to use again, I said. She frowned at me. Pots don't grow on trees, she said. Are you making something for your father? Not right now. This is for Kate. For Mrs. Cleary? I was amazed that she saw a distinction. Yes, I said. My mother gave me a long look. Just days before, she had sent me to the shed to sleep with the dogs, my belly as empty as a hat on a hook for trying to wake my father. Now, with only a little pause, she fetched an old blackened pot and handed it to me without another word. I wondered if she was so willing because I had earned some trust, or because I was now trying to heal Kate instead of my daddy. I decided it didn't matter. I carried the pot back to where Kate lay waiting. She watched me carefully as I took out my knife and sliced away a broad strip of deer hide from her leggings. She said nothing out loud, though her face made a comment or two, especially her eyebrows, before it settled into a smile. Larkin told you some things about his father's looting, didn't he? He did, I said, wiping my knife on my sleeve and folding it away. I draped the deer hide over my arm and picked up the old pot. This will take a while, I said. Not so long if you boil it hard, she replied. An hour over a fire is all you need, though be ready to stir it right along. She smiled sadly. It would be different if I were a mandolin. For that, all night, long, slowly in an oven, works best. I didn't say we don't have all night long. Nor did I say, "You're not a mandolin." I said, "Close your eyes and rest while I do this. Captain's here, and I don't imagine he'll leave you." Esther was in the kitchen with my mother when I came back through on my way to the yard. "How's Larkin?" I said, though I didn't like to be the one asking, or her the one answering. "He's sad and angry and ashamed of himself," she said, "for you being the one who's helping her." So I was not the only one feeling out of sorts about such things. I wanted to go find him right then, to tell him that I understood, and to be the one he understood in return. Later I would do that, find him, after I'd helped Kate, after I'd helped my father, after all that, if he hadn't come to find me first. "What's that?" my mother said, nodding at the deer hide that hung from my arm. "Deer hide," I said. "What for?" she said as I gathered up my pack. "You'll see. It's hard to explain." She followed me to the cabin door and stood watching as I laid the deer hide on the ground and scraped the hair away with my knife until nothing but leather remained. But she went back to work when I knelt to build a fire where we had made soap. Before the fire got too big, I laid stones in a small circle around its edge so the pot would sit above the ground and the flames would stay where I wanted them. While the fire was growing, I cut the leather into strips and tucked them all into the old pot, added a little water from the well, and set the pot on the fire. "What are you doing?" Samuel said as he crept out of nowhere and my shadow merged with his. "Playing the piano," I said. He made a sound that was mostly snort. "You are not, Ellie. You're cooking something." "Then why did you ask?" He peered into the pot. "What is it? Is it something to eat?" "Maybe if you're a wolf," I said. "A very hungry wolf." "Well, I'm not a wolf," he said, though he sounded a little doubtful, as if he reserved the right to eat what I was cooking should it prove to be something sweet. "I'm making glue," I said, stirring the strips of hide with a bare stick as the water began to simmer. "What did you break?" he said happily. For once he was not the one who had done the breaking. "Nothing," I said, "but I'm going to fix it anyway." Samuel poked at the fire with a stick of his own. "How do you know how to make glue? Did Daddy teach you that too?" I shook my head. "I taught me how. I just hope I taught me well." He made a face at that. "You're silly." He poked at the fire some more. "Do you need help?" "Always," I said, though it wasn't true. Though it was. Chapter 66. Samuel and I spent the next hour tending the fire and the pot as the deer hide slowly melted down toward glue, and the day trod on toward evening. "I think it's done," I finally said, letting some drizzle from the end of the stir stick. "That's a lot of glue." He looked around the yard. "What's so big and broken that you need all that glue to fix it?" "Kate," I said, using a rag to move the pot off the fire. I set it aside to cool. "You mean the hag?" he said, astonished. I nodded. "I do." But I knew he was astonished by the idea that I could glue her back together, not that it was a hag I meant to heal. "What are you brewing out there?" my mother asked when we came into the cabin to check on Kate. I liked that we were brewing something. I liked that word. "Glue," Samuel said. I could see that my mother wanted to ask more, but she didn't. She simply turned back to her work, which was a supper of cornbread and beans and one of the trout. And a pie. Something as uncommon as hen's teeth these days. "Is that a pie?" Samuel said, his eyes amazed. "Of a sort," my mother said with a sigh. "Dried blueberries and apples with walnuts and a little maple syrup, which is hardly what I'd choose to bake, but bake it I will." "For Miss Kate?" I said. She nodded. "How often do we have a guest in this house?" I wouldn't have called Kate a guest, but I was glad that my mother saw her that way. At the bedroom door we found both Kate and my father sleeping, though differently. I could see that just by looking at them. Even asleep, Kate looked as if she were aware. Esther was there too, sitting alongside the bed in the rocking chair, reading aloud to both of them, and to Captain too, as they slept. A very good book about a bear named Winnie, and a pig named Piglet, and a host of others that I had loved and still loved, and would always love. I was jealous at the thought that Kate might be meeting Pooh and Piglet for the very first time, like tasting a first strawberry or hearing a first loon, since the book was only a little older than Samuel and meant for children at a time when her son was already grown. But perhaps she had read it to Larkin when he was little, as my mother had to me. As Esther had to me too, I realized, when she had only just learned to read, the story coming out word by word, slowly and carefully, like a cat when a dog's nearby. But that hadn't mattered at all. What I remembered best was lying next to my sister at bedtime, tucked in together, while she read that story to me. When Esther looked up from the book to find me and Samuel standing in the doorway, watching, she stopped. I expected annoyance, impatience, but she simply paused, as if we were a couple of songbirds on the windowsill, not so much a distraction as something worth noticing, and I felt my heart swell, the way a bud will when the days grow warm. And that's when Kate said, without opening her eyes, "Why did you stop, girl?" And I heard in her voice that she was in more pain than she should be, more pain than I'd thought. And I knew it was time for me to do something about that. "Is the hat going to live here with us now?" Samuel whispered after we'd crept out of the room. "If now means right now, then yes," I said, "but beyond that I can't say." Which seemed to satisfy Samuel, a here-and-now sort of boy, if ever there was one. "Can I have some vinegar?" I asked my mother. She looked at me curiously. "For your father this time?" she said as she pulled a jug of vinegar from the cupboard. "Maybe later. Right now for Miss Kate." "Right now, supper," she said. "You can take her a plate and then eat your own, and then you can do whatever it is you plan to do." "I'm not hungry," I said, though I was. "And I need to tend to her leg now. I'll feed her and myself after I get that sorted out." My mother turned to Samuel. "Go fetch Esther," she said, and then, when he had gone, turned to me with a hard look on her face. "Ellie, I can't make up my mind about all this. Mrs. Cleary seems to think it's all right that she's come here to get better, I suppose, and help your father, though I don't see how when she's the one who needs a doctor. She needs a doctor, Ellie, not some barbaric kind of glue and vinegar and heaven knows what else you've got in mind." She sighed. "Yes, I'll admit it, you've done some interesting things for your father, and he's no worse for them. Maybe even better. But you're not a doctor, Ellie. You're 12. You're just a girl, whatever else you might be, whatever else Mrs. Cleary thinks you are." More else's. I waited. This was my mother, sorting herself out, which was her job more than mine. "I must be mad as a hatter to stand here baking a terrible little pie, while Mrs. Cleary rots away in that bed alongside your bee-stung father." She wiped her hands on her apron and heaved another sigh. "But in the morning we will all come to our senses and send Mr. Peterson to fetch the doctor." At the look on my face she held up a hand. "And that is that." She handed me the vinegar. I poured some into a pot, careful to hold back the cloudy mother that we'd need to start the next batch, and put the pot on the back of the stove where the heat from the oven would warm it. "Yuck," Samuel said, coming back into the kitchen, Esther with him. "Another bad smell." "Just vinegar," I said. "For what?" "For you," I said. "You're too sweet. You need a little tart." Samuel took a step back. "What does she mean, Mother?" "Nothing," she said. "Now wash up and sit down and eat." Instead, he sidled up next to me. "What's the vinegar for?" he asked again. "For Kate." "Glue and vinegar?" "Glue and vinegar." "Samuel," my mother said, "get washed up. I won't tell you again." But when I came out to the yard to fetch the glue, he followed me as a puppy would, and I realized that when Mr. Anderson took quiet, I would need Samuel more than ever. The thought brought me to a stop. Samuel looked up at me as I stood there with dusk coming on. "What's wrong, Ellie?" I didn't want to think about losing quiet, losing anything. "Nothing. Go on in to supper now, or you'll get no pie." But I almost called him back as he scampered off toward the cabin. Chapter 67. "This first part shouldn't hurt a bit," I told Kate as I settled a lantern and the glue pot next to the bed. "But I brought some willow tea down from your cabin and never used it. Would you like some now? For what's coming?" "No," she said after a moment. "It will lower my fever, and I need that fever right now to fight the germ." She nodded at the glue pot. "It's cool enough?" I nodded. "I think so." It felt odd to be sitting with Kate, intent on her instead of my father, who lay just there, on the other side of her, without a sound or any suggestion of life except the slow bellows of his lungs, the heart that I could hear somewhere inside my own chest. I turned all my attention back to Kate. I untied the bandages again and gently unwrapped her leg. "We should thank those bees," I said, leaning close to study the wound. It didn't smell as bad as it had before, but it was still foul enough. "No should about it," Kate said. "Do, every day. Them and the trees and the flowers and every other kind of doctor to be had." Which was all true, and more besides. "Now don't move. I want the glue to stay put." Kate hopped. "Isn't that the whole point of glue?" And why go to so much trouble? Why not clean things out and wrap me up again?" She looked like she already knew the answer to that, but I sat back, the pot poised in my hand, and gave her one anyway. I thought of just pouring the vinegar again and again over the bandages so they'd keep the cut good and wet for a day or two, but I think the cut needs to be drenched. I think the vinegar needs to seep all the way in to keep the honey soft and sink down deep to the bottom of the wound. I think we need to clean it out from the bottom up, else we might not get at all the corruption. I leaned again toward the wound. I don't want it to spread any more than it already has. Kate smiled tiredly. It's a lot of thinking. I remembered what she'd said to me on the mountain top, about whether a hag was the kind of person who would read books. A lot of thinking for a 12-year-old girl, which earned me her customary snort. A lot of thinking for anyone. Slowly, bit by bit, I spooned the glue in a ring around Kate's wound, then stirred what was in the pot while I waited for the stuff on her leg to firm up a bit. In the lull, I wondered where Larkin was, and hoped he would come back soon, and with no rancor. It was more important that Kate got well than who got her there. Captain, who had stayed as close to Kate as he could, climbed to his feet and stretched his front legs out before him, his tail in the air, threw his head back and yawned a mighty yawn. Then he shook himself all over and looked at me expectantly. "Do you want to go out, boy?" "He'll go to the door if he does," Kate muttered without opening her eyes, "and he'll ask for some supper after you've had yours." I spooned another ring of glue above the first, using the smooth side of the stick to nudge it back to neat, though I can't say it was a pretty business. "None of this should feel good," Kate said, "but it does." I smiled. When I'm sick, I love how my mother takes care of me. The sound of her moving around my bed while I lie with my eyes closed, how it feels when she lays a cloth on my forehead. I began another ring of glue atop the last. Almost worth being sick. Kate sighed. "I'd like to think I made someone feel that way when I was a nurse," which astonished me. "Ask Esther," I said. She smiled. "I can smell the hot vinegar." I could smell it too, sharp as broken glass. She opened her eyes. "Won't it melt the glue away?" "It might, a bit, but maybe not too much. And if it does, it does." I didn't care what kind of mess it made. Kate lifted her head up again to watch me working. For a time we were silent while I added more glue, blowing on it until I had a skin, soft but firm. My mother at the door said, "I've brought you some more tea." The smell of balsam twined with the smell of the vinegar, and I felt as if I were in a fresh winter garden, though the stink of the glue failed to give much ground. She brought 2 mugs of tea into the room and set them on the windowsill. She made sure not to look at what I was doing to Kate's leg. "Is everything all right?" "It is," I said. "Will you bring that vinegar now?" She waited for a long moment. Then she went to do as I'd asked. After a moment she came back into the room carrying the pot of steaming vinegar. "I don't know what you—" But as she neared the bed she saw Kate's wound, and she almost dropped the pot. "Mercy," she whispered. "What are you doing, Ellen?" "Here, just put it on the floor by the bed. I'll need a ladle too, please, and a clean rag or two." She looked at us, a little wild-eyed, but then she stopped and took a closer look at what I'd made, at the glue dam and the swollen wound in the middle of it, and said, "You mean to pour hot vinegar in there?" "I do, but not hot enough to burn her, and just a little at a time, so it can seep in with the honey and clean the wound." She looked at Kate. "Is this another thing you've taught her?" "Heavens, no," Kate said. "This is her idea. If anything, I've bungled the whole deal since the beginning. If I'd let her run the show, I'd be right as rain by now." "Though I did plan to burn you with a hot chisel," I said, which made my mother flinch. She put the pot on the floor. "If it's bad enough to do this, should we not send for the doctor right now?" I looked at Kate and could see that she didn't want to get into that again, the business of paying or not paying a man who might arrive in a day or 2 or 3, when she would either be better or beyond whatever help he could give. "I believe we have a doctor right here," she said, nodding at me. "And I'm a nurse, don't forget, so all we lack is some medicine that people have been doing without for thousands of years." Nobody said, "and dying for lack of it," though I'll bet we all thought it. My mother said, "If you're sure." Kate nodded. We waited while my mother went for what we needed. When she came back, she paused. She looked like she had something to say. I knew my mother. I knew she was still struggling. But the hag was Mrs. Cleary, the same nurse who had helped Esther through a course of earaches so bad they'd made her scream. And I was the same girl who had made my daddy's hand twitch and his eyes roll, made him groan, was maybe the reason he had opened his eyes, even if just for a little while. I smiled at her, the flame in my chest so bright I was surprised she couldn't see it shining from my eyes. But perhaps she could, since she finally said, This is all so strange, and I don't understand much of it, but I'm sorry for how hard I've been. I thought of Larkin's mother, Esther, Kate, and me myself. Daddy's been asleep for months, I said. How were you supposed to be? And you're right. I am a 12-year-old girl. I'm not a doctor. So it's all right, Mother. Which earned me a look I'd keep for a long, long time. After she'd gone out again, I shut the door and turned back to the bed. Kate said, "Would you really have burned me with that chisel?" It was the same question Larkin had asked days before, though the answer was no longer true. I shrugged. I didn't know what else to do. I'm ever so glad you didn't have to do that. Me too. It would have made things worse. Yes, but something like that. She stopped to choose her words. It's something you should never have to do. Because I'm 12? At which Kate looked disappointed. Hurt even. Because no one should have to do such a thing if there's another way. If there's an else. Even this, she said, the hot vinegar. What you're about to do will stay with you for your whole life. I nodded. I hope so. Which earned me another look I'd hold on to forever. And then I'll know how, I said. One more thing I can do. Kate smiled. Just hours ago we were talking about your father and skunk stink and horseradish. We were, and now this. She gestured at her leg, which reminded me of the balsam sap I'd given for Scotch's hoof instead of using it on my father's scar, the egg I'd fed to Maisie instead of using it to lure a skunk, the honey I'd left for the bees instead of adding it to my medicine brew, and the time I'd spent up mountain instead of here by my father's side. My mother thinks he will wake or he won't, regardless of what I try, I said. You think that's true? I remembered what Kate had said to me not long before. Tell me what true is. She smiled, said nothing. I tried to find the words to say something I'd never said before. It seems to me that what I do for one thing is what I do for everything, which wasn't exactly right. I can do this, I said, looking at her wound. So I will. And I have an idea that it will be more than what it is. Kate didn't say anything about that, and I didn't know if she understood me. But I thought maybe she did. And we'll read more tomorrow.